The courthouse was silent, except for the rustle of papers and the soft click of my heels against the marble floor. I sat in the witness stand, my hands steady on the microphone, facing the man I had called my husband for 5 years. David Mitchell looked exactly as he always had. Perfectly pressed suit. That charming smile that once made my heart race, now making my stomach turn. But today, none of his charm would save him. The prosecutor held up a stack of documents, bank statements showing millions of dollars flowing through accounts I never knew existed. When she asked me to identify the signature on the fraudulent property deeds, I didn't hesitate. That was when David's facade finally cracked, and he screamed across the courtroom, "You destroyed everything we built together, Sarah." Everything. His lawyer tried to silence him, but the damage was done. The jury had seen the real David Mitchell, and so had I, 5 months too late. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and until 5 months ago, I thought I was living the perfect life. I was 32 years old, working as a marketing coordinator for a small tech startup in Portland, married to David Mitchell, the most successful real estate developer in Millbrook, Oregon. Our house on Maple Ridge Drive was everything I had dreamed of as a little girl growing up in a cramped apartment downtown. White picket fence, wraparound porch, and a view of the Cascade Mountains that took my breath away every morning when I opened the kitchen curtains. David was everything my mother had hoped I would find. Tall, successful, charming in that effortless way that made waitresses linger at our table and made other women at dinner parties hang on his every word. He owned Mitchell & Associates Real Estate, the most prestigious firm in our county, and everyone in Millbrook knew his name. He sponsored the local Little League team, volunteered at the food bank during holidays, and never missed Sunday service at First Presbyterian. When we walked down Main Street together, people would wave and call out his name like he was running for mayor. But that perfect life shattered on September 15th, our 5th wedding anniversary, when I found David's secret office hidden behind a false wall in our basement. The day started like any other anniversary. David had left early for what he called an important client meeting, promising to be back by 6 for our dinner reservation at Le Bernardin, the French restaurant where he had proposed. I had taken the day off work to prepare, spending the morning at the salon getting my hair done, picking up the watch I had engraved for him as an anniversary gift, and stopping by the flower shop to arrange white roses throughout the house, the same flowers from our wedding bouquet. I was in the basement around 3 in the afternoon, looking for our wedding photo albums to display for the evening, when I heard a strange humming sound coming from behind the workshop area. David had always told me the basement workshop was off limits, claiming it was his space to unwind after stressful days, filled with dangerous power tools and half-finished projects that would bore me anyway. I had respected that boundary for 5 years, never questioning why he spent so many late nights down there, or why he always locked the door behind him. But the humming sound was persistent, almost like an air conditioning unit, and I was worried something might be overheating. I followed the sound to what I thought was just a blank wall behind his workbench, but when I pressed against it, searching for the source of the noise, a section of the drywall shifted. My heart started racing as I realized there was a hidden door, and it was slightly ajar. I should have stopped there. I should have respected his privacy and waited to ask him about it when he came home. But something deep in my gut, some instinct I had been ignoring for months, pushed me forward. I pressed the hidden panel, and it swung open to reveal a narrow hallway leading to a fully furnished office I never knew existed. The room was immaculate, like something from a movie set. Mahogany desk, leather chair, filing cabinets lining the walls, and 3 different computer monitors displaying what looked like real estate listings. But these weren't properties I recognized from David's regular business. The addresses were from different states, different cities I had never heard him mention. California, Nevada, Arizona, Texas. Properties worth millions of dollars, all listed under company names I didn't recognize. I sat down in his chair, my hands shaking as I clicked through the computer files. Spreadsheets showing cash transactions, wire transfers, property acquisitions and sales, all happening through shell companies with names like Sunset Holdings, Desert Vista Properties, and Mountain Peak Investments. The numbers were staggering. In the past 3 years alone, these companies had generated over $15 million in revenue. Money that never appeared in our joint bank accounts. Money I had never seen. But it wasn't just the money that made my blood run cold. It was the filing cabinet marked client files that contained folders for dozens of people I didn't know. Elderly individuals with detailed financial profiles, copies of their wills, their medical records, their family contact information. People like Eleanor Washburn, an 87-year-old widow whose file contained her complete medical history, copies of her property deeds, and handwritten notes about her deteriorating mental state, and no close family to notice discrepancies. Each file contained the same pattern. Elderly clients, mostly widows or widowers, detailed financial information, and properties that had been sold multiple times under different company names. Properties that these clients thought they still owned, based on the letters in their files thanking David for managing their estate so well. I found contracts showing that David had been selling the same properties to multiple buyers, collecting full payments from each, while the original elderly owners believed their homes were safely in trust. He would sell Eleanor Washburn's house to 3 different families, collect 3 separate down payments and mortgage approvals, then disappear the properties into shell companies before anyone realized what had happened. By the time the buyers discovered they didn't actually own anything, David had moved the money through so many corporate layers that it was impossible to trace. The most horrifying discovery was a folder labeled insurance claims, containing life insurance policies on his elderly clients, policies they had never signed, with David listed as the beneficiary. The medical records in their files weren't just for real estate fraud. He was tracking their health conditions, waiting for them to die so he could collect on policies they didn't know existed. I sat in that hidden office for 2 hours, printing documents, copying files to a USB drive, my mind racing as I tried to process what I was seeing. This wasn't just fraud. This was systematic exploitation of vulnerable elderly people, some of whom David had been slowly poisoning based on the medical notes I found detailing their sudden decline and unexpected complications. When I heard David preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. David's car in the driveway at 6:30. I quickly shut down the computers, grabbed the USB drive, and slipped back upstairs, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I managed to get to the kitchen and start preparing dinner, trying to act normal, trying to process everything I had discovered. David walked in with his usual confident smile, carrying a bouquet of red roses and a bottle of champagne. He kissed my cheek and apologized for being late, explaining that his client meeting had run longer than expected. As he talked about his day, describing a property deal he was negotiating for a sweet elderly couple who needed help managing their estate, I realized he was talking about people he was actively defrauding. "You seem distracted tonight," he said during dinner, reaching across the table to touch my hand. "Everything okay, sweetheart?" I forced a smile and told him I was just tired from the busy day, but inside I was screaming. The man sitting across from me, the man I had shared a bed with for 5 years, was a predator who had built our entire life on stolen money and destroyed lives. Every vacation we had taken, every piece of furniture in our house, every gift he had given me, had been paid for with money stolen from vulnerable elderly people. That night, as David slept beside me, I lay awake planning my next move. I couldn't go to the police in Millbrook. David played golf with the police chief every Thursday. He had donated money to the sheriff's re-election campaign. Half the city council owed their positions to his political connections. I needed help from someone outside his sphere of influence, someone who couldn't be bought or intimidated. The next morning, after David left for work, I drove 2 hours to Portland and walked into the FBI field office downtown. I asked to speak with someone about financial fraud, and after waiting for 3 hours, I was finally called into a small conference room where Agent Patricia Hayes listened to my story with increasing concern. Agent Hayes was a tall woman in her 40s with steel gray hair and eyes that seemed to see everything. She didn't interrupt as I laid out everything I had discovered, showing her the printed documents and the USB drive full of files. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, then asked me the question I had been dreading. "Mrs. Mitchell," she said carefully, "did you have any knowledge of your husband's business practices before yesterday?" The implication was clear. Was I a co-conspirator looking for immunity? Or was I truly an innocent wife who had stumbled onto her husband's crimes? I understood why she had to ask, but it still stung. For 5 years, I had been completely trusting, completely naive. I had never questioned why David always handled our finances alone, why he never wanted me involved in his business, why we lived so well on what seemed like a modest real estate income. "Agent Hayes," I said, meeting her eyes directly, "I had no idea. I thought I was married to a successful businessman, not a criminal who was stealing from elderly people. If I had known, I would have reported it years ago." She studied my face for another long moment, then nodded. "I believe you, Mrs. Mitchell, and I think you may have just handed us the evidence we need to stop one of the most sophisticated real estate fraud schemes we've seen in years." That was the beginning of the most terrifying and isolating 3 months of my life. Agent Hayes explained that in order to build a solid case, I would need to continue living with David, pretending everything was normal, while helping the FBI gather additional evidence. I would have to wear recording devices, copy more files, and participate in conversations designed to get David to incriminate himself. The hardest part wasn't the danger, though I was terrified that David would discover what I was doing. The hardest part was the complete isolation. I couldn't tell my friends what was happening. I couldn't confide in my family. I had to smile and laugh and play the role of the happy wife while knowing that my entire marriage had been built on lies and stolen money. Emma Thompson, my closest friend in Millbrook, started noticing changes in my behavior within the first week. Emma was a teacher at the local elementary school, one of the few people in town who didn't seem impressed by David's wealth and status. She had always been slightly suspicious of him, though she had never said so directly. "You seem different lately," she said during our usual coffee date at Riverside Cafe. "Everything okay at home?" I wanted desperately to tell her everything, to have someone to share the weight of what I was carrying, but Agent Hayes had been clear about the need for absolute secrecy. Instead, I made up stories about work stress and mentioned that David and I were going through a rough patch, which wasn't entirely untrue. Emma frowned and leaned forward. "Sarah, you know you can talk to me about anything, right? If something's wrong, if you need help, I'm here." I forced another smile and changed the subject, but I caught Emma watching me with concern for the rest of our conversation. It was the first time I realized how completely alone I was in this situation. Everyone in Millbrook adored David. If I tried to tell them what I had discovered without FBI backing, they would assume I was having some kind of mental breakdown. The recording equipment Agent Hayes gave me was smaller than I expected, a tiny device that clipped inside my bra, completely invisible under clothing. But every morning when I put it on, I felt like I was strapping on armor for battle. Each conversation with David became a careful dance, trying to steer him toward topics that might provide useful evidence while avoiding anything that might make him suspicious. David had always been observant, one of the qualities that made him such a successful salesman. He could read people, understand what they wanted to hear, adapt his approach accordingly. Those same skills made him dangerous to deceive. I had to be perfect in my performance every single day, because one slip, one moment of appearing too interested in his business or asking the wrong question could expose everything. 3 weeks into the investigation, I made my first real breakthrough. David came home from work frustrated about a deal that was falling through, and after a few glasses of wine, he started venting about how ungrateful his clients were. "I spend months setting up these perfect arrangements," he said, pacing around our living room, making sure everything is handled properly, and then their families start asking questions. Do they appreciate that I'm taking care of everything so they don't have to worry? Of course not. I pressed gently for more details, expressing sympathy for how hard he worked to help people. That's when he started talking about Mrs. Eleanor Washburn, the elderly widow whose file I had seen in his secret office. "Eleanor's been one of my best clients for 3 years, he said, settling back onto the couch beside me. "Completely trusting, never asks complicated questions, lets me handle everything. But now her nephew is sniffing around, asking about property transfers, wanting to see paperwork. It's frustrating when family members interfere with perfectly good business relationships. As he talked, I realized that David genuinely believed he was providing a service. In his mind, he was helping elderly people by taking the burden of financial management off their shoulders. The fact that he was stealing their life savings and selling their homes multiple times was just business, just the cost of his expertise. "What will you do about the nephew?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. David's expression darkened. "I'll handle it. There are ways to discourage people from asking too many questions. Sometimes family members just need to understand that their interference isn't in everyone's best interest." The threat in his voice made my blood run cold, but I forced myself to nod supportively. When I listened to the recording later with Agent Hayes, she agreed that David's words suggested he might be willing to use intimidation or worse to protect his schemes. By the end of October, the FBI had enough evidence to arrest David, but Agent Hayes wanted to catch him in the act of defrauding a new victim. They had been monitoring his communications and discovered he was targeting a 90-year-old man named Robert Chen, who had recently lost his wife and was struggling with early-stage dementia. The plan was for me to suggest that David invite Mr. Chen to our house for dinner, creating an opportunity for the FBI to record him attempting to manipulate an elderly victim. It was risky, because David would be suspicious if I suddenly started showing interest in his work, but Agent Hayes felt it was our best chance to get video evidence of his tactics. I approached the topic carefully, mentioning during breakfast that I felt bad about how little I knew about his clients, that I wanted to be more supportive of his work. David seemed pleased by this interest, probably interpreting it as a sign that our marriage was getting back on track after the rough patch he had noticed. "Actually," he said, "there is someone I've been working with who might enjoy a home-cooked meal. Robert Chen, lovely gentleman, just lost his wife. He's been having some memory issues, and I think he gets lonely eating by himself all the time." The dinner was scheduled for November 3rd. Agent Hayes positioned surveillance equipment throughout our house, hidden cameras in the dining room and living room, recording devices that would capture everything David said to Mr. Chen. I spent the day cooking, trying to prepare both a nice meal and my own mental state for what I was about to witness. Mr. Chen arrived at 6 o'clock, a frail man with kind eyes who reminded me of my own grandfather. David was immediately charming, helping him with his coat, asking about his health, expressing sympathy for his recent loss. For the first part of the evening, David seemed like the caring businessman I had originally fallen in love with. But as dinner progressed and David began discussing Mr. Chen's finances, I watched my husband transform into someone I didn't recognize. He used every manipulation tactic in the book, playing on Mr. Chen's grief, his confusion about his wife's complex estate planning, his fear of being a burden to his adult children. "The most important thing," David said, reaching across the table to pat Mr. Chen's hand, "is making sure your family doesn't have to deal with complicated legal issues after you're gone. I can set up a trust that will handle everything automatically, make sure all your properties are properly managed, take that burden completely off your children's shoulders." Mr. Chen seemed grateful for David's concern, asking questions about how the trust would work, whether his children would still inherit everything as planned. David assured him that the trust would protect his assets better than a traditional will, that his children would actually receive more money because of the tax advantages. What Mr. Chen didn't understand was that the trust David was describing would give David complete control over all his properties, with the legal right to sell them and manage the proceeds as he saw fit. By the time Mr. Chen's children realized what had happened, David would have liquidated everything and moved the money through his network of shell companies. I sat at that dinner table, smiling and serving dessert, while watching my husband systematically manipulate a vulnerable elderly man into signing away his entire life savings. It was one of the most difficult things I had ever done, pretending to be supportive while witnessing such calculated cruelty. After Mr. Chen left, David was in an excellent mood, talking about how the trust arrangement would be finalized within the week. He opened a bottle of expensive champagne to celebrate, toasting to another satisfied client, and building security for people who need it most. I excused myself early, claiming I had a headache, and spent the night in our guest bedroom, unable to bear sleeping next to him after what I had witnessed. When I met with Agent Hayes the next morning, she confirmed that the dinner had provided everything they needed for a conviction. "We're moving forward with the arrest," she said. "Tomorrow morning we'll take him into custody at his office. I want you to be somewhere safe, away from the house, when it happens. Once he's arrested, this whole story is going to become very public very quickly." The morning of November 4th, I packed a suitcase and drove to Emma's house, telling her I needed somewhere to stay for a few days, while David and I worked through some marital problems. Emma welcomed me without questions, setting up her guest room and promising to give me all the space I needed. At 10:30 that morning, my phone started ringing. First David's business partner, Rebecca Chen, then his lawyer, then David himself calling from the police station. I let all the calls go to voicemail, but I could hear the panic and confusion in their voices as word spread through Millbrook that David Mitchell had been arrested for fraud. By noon, news vans were parked outside our house on Maple Ridge Drive. The local newspaper had picked up the story, and reporters were interviewing neighbors, trying to understand how Millbrook's most respected businessman could be accused of such serious crimes. Emma found me sitting in her kitchen, staring at the news coverage on her laptop, and demanded to know what was really going on. I broke down and told her everything, from finding the secret office to working with the FBI for 3 months. Emma listened in shocked silence, then wrapped me in the biggest hug I had received since this nightmare began. "I knew something was wrong," she said. "I could see it in your eyes, but I never imagined anything like this. Sarah, you're so brave. What you did, exposing all of this, you probably saved dozens of people from being robbed." Her words meant more to me than she could possibly know. For months, I had felt like I was betraying my marriage, questioning whether I was doing the right thing. Hearing Emma confirm that I had made the right choice gave me the strength I needed for what came next. David made bail within 48 hours, and the harassment began immediately. Phone calls at all hours, sometimes from David himself, sometimes from people claiming to be his supporters, all accusing me of destroying an innocent man's life for money or attention. Someone threw a brick through Emma's front window with a note that read, "Traitors get what they deserve." David's lawyer held a press conference claiming I was an unstable wife, seeking revenge for an affair that never happened. The worst part was the way the community turned against me. People I had known for 5 years, neighbors I had chatted with at block parties, church members I had volunteered beside at charity events, all suddenly believed I was a vindictive liar, trying to destroy a good man's reputation. Rebecca Chen, David's business partner, who I later learned had been helping him launder money through fake property transactions, started a whisper campaign about my mental health. She told anyone who would listen that I had been struggling with depression and paranoia, that I had probably planted evidence in David's office during one of my episodes. The isolation was devastating. Emma and her family stood by me, but everyone else in Millbrook treated me like I had committed the crimes myself. I couldn't go to the grocery store without people staring and whispering. The tech startup I worked for let me go, claiming they needed to downsize, but I knew it was because of the negative publicity. Agent Hayes warned me that this kind of community backlash was common in cases involving prominent local figures. People don't want to believe that someone they trusted and admired could be capable of such crimes, she explained. It's easier to blame the messenger than accept that they were deceived. The preliminary hearings began in December, and the evidence Agent Hayes and her team had gathered was overwhelming. Bank records showing the flow of stolen money, recordings of David manipulating elderly clients, testimony from victims' families who had been searching for answers about their missing inheritances. But David's defense team, led by one of Portland's most expensive criminal attorneys, painted me as an unreliable witness with ulterior motives. They claimed I had discovered David's legitimate business dealings and misinterpreted them due to my mental instability and resentment over our failing marriage. During my testimony, David's lawyer grilled me for hours about my marriage, my mental health, my motivations for contacting the FBI. He suggested that I had planted evidence in David's office, that I had coached elderly witnesses to lie about their interactions with David, that I was working with federal agents to frame an innocent man. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said during cross-examination, "isn't it true that you have been receiving therapy for depression and anxiety? I had seen a counselor twice after my father died 3 years earlier. Something completely normal and healthy, but David's lawyer made it sound like evidence of severe mental illness. The courtroom was packed with David's supporters, people nodding along with every suggestion that I was unstable and vindictive. But then something unexpected happened. Dr. Patricia Hayes, the forensic psychologist Agent Hayes had recommended I work with during the investigation, took the stand as an expert witness. Dr. Hayes had been evaluating me for months, assessing my mental state and the reliability of my testimony. In my professional opinion, Dr. Hayes told the court, Mrs. Mitchell shows no signs of the kind of mental instability or vindictive personality that would lead her to fabricate evidence or make false accusations. Her responses to psychological testing are consistent with someone who has experienced significant trauma from discovering her spouse's criminal behavior, but she demonstrates remarkable emotional resilience and clear thinking under extreme stress. Dr. Hayes explained that my decision to work with the FBI for 3 months, despite the personal risk and emotional toll, demonstrated exactly the kind of moral character and mental stability that made me a credible witness. She pointed out that someone seeking revenge or attention would not have spent months carefully gathering evidence and working within the legal system. The prosecution then called Robert Chen's daughter Linda, who testified about how David had manipulated her father into signing papers he didn't understand, while her father was grieving and confused. She described the relief her family felt when the FBI investigation prevented David from stealing her father's life savings. My father trusted Mr. Mitchell completely, Linda said, tears streaming down her face. He thought David was helping him, protecting his estate so our family would be taken care of. If Mrs. Mitchell hadn't exposed what was really happening, we would have lost everything. My father would have died thinking he had secured our future, never knowing he had been robbed. One by one, the families of David's victims took the stand to describe how his schemes had devastated their lives. Eleanor Washburn's nephew explained how they had discovered that Eleanor's house had been sold to 3 different families, leaving her homeless and penniless in her final months. An elderly man named Frank Morrison testified about how David had convinced him to sign power of attorney papers, then immediately liquidated all his assets and disappeared the money through shell companies. The evidence was overwhelming, but David maintained his innocence throughout the trial, claiming that all his business dealings had been legitimate and properly documented. He portrayed himself as a victim of a vindictive wife and an overzealous federal investigation. During his own testimony, David was calm and confident, using the same charm that had made him successful in real estate to appeal to the jury. He expressed sympathy for the elderly clients who felt they had been mistreated, but insisted that any confusion about their financial arrangements was due to their age and memory problems, not any deception on his part. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he said, looking directly at each of them, I have spent my entire career helping people navigate complex real estate transactions and estate planning. Sometimes, especially with elderly clients, there can be misunderstandings about what was agreed upon. But I have never, not once in 15 years of business, intentionally deceived or stolen from anyone. It was a masterful performance, and I could see some jury members nodding along with his explanations. David had always been persuasive, and even facing overwhelming evidence, he was still trying to charm his way out of consequences. But then the prosecution played the recording from our anniversary dinner with Mr. Chen. The jury heard David's voice clearly explaining how the trust he was proposing would give him complete control over Mr. Chen's assets, followed by his private comments to me afterward about how easy it was to manipulate elderly clients who didn't ask complicated questions. The recording was devastating because it showed David's true attitude toward his victims, his complete lack of empathy or remorse. This wasn't a businessman who had made mistakes or misunderstood his clients' wishes. This was a predator who deliberately targeted vulnerable people and celebrated his success in exploiting them. When the verdict was read on December 20th, exactly 5 months after I had discovered David's secret office, the jury found him guilty on all counts: wire fraud, money laundering, elder abuse, and conspiracy. The judge sentenced him to 25 years in federal prison and ordered him to pay restitution of over $12 million to his victims. As the bailiff led David away in handcuffs, he turned to look at me one last time. The charming mask had finally slipped completely, and I saw nothing but cold hatred in his eyes. "You destroyed everything," he mouthed silently, the same words he had screamed in the courthouse months earlier. but I realized in that moment that David was wrong. I hadn't destroyed anything real. The life we had built together was always a lie, constructed with stolen money and built on the suffering of vulnerable people. What I had actually done was expose the truth and give his victims a chance at justice. The aftermath of David's conviction was complicated. Our house on Maple Ridge Drive was seized by federal agents as part of the restitution process, along with most of our other assets. I was left with my car, my personal belongings, and about $15,000 from a savings account that predated our marriage. Starting over at 32 was terrifying, but it was also liberating. I moved back to Portland, found a small apartment in a neighborhood where no one knew my story, and slowly began rebuilding my life. Emma helped me find a new job with a marketing firm that specialized in working with nonprofit organizations, companies that focused on helping vulnerable populations rather than exploiting them. The transition wasn't easy. I had nightmares for months about David discovering my deception, about the recording equipment failing, about the trial going wrong and David being acquitted. I started seeing Dr. Hayes regularly, not as a forensic evaluation but as actual therapy, to help me process the trauma of discovering that my entire marriage had been built on lies. But gradually, I began to find peace. I joined a support group for people who had been deceived by family members involved in financial crimes, and I discovered I wasn't alone in my experience. There were other spouses, children, and siblings who had made the difficult choice to expose their loved one's criminal behavior, and we helped each other navigate the complex emotions of betrayal, guilt, and recovery. 6 months after David's conviction, I received a letter from Linda Chen, Robert's daughter. She wrote to thank me again for preventing her father from being victimized, and to let me know that Robert was doing well in a memory care facility that his family could now afford because his assets had been protected. I know it cost you everything to expose what David was doing, Linda wrote, but I want you to know that your courage saved my father's dignity and our family's future. You are a hero to all of us, even if the people in Millbrook were too blind to see it. Reading that letter, I finally understood that I had made the right choice. Yes, it had cost me my marriage, my home, my social connections, and my sense of security. But it had also saved dozens of elderly people from being robbed of their life savings, and it had allowed me to discover who I really was when everything familiar was stripped away. Today, I work with federal agents as a consultant, helping them understand the warning signs of financial fraud and teaching other potential witnesses how to gather evidence safely. It's meaningful work that uses my painful experience to protect other vulnerable people from predators like David. I still live quietly in Portland, still rebuilding relationships and learning to trust my own judgment again. I don't know if I'll ever remarry or if I'll ever feel completely safe from the kind of deception I experienced with David. But I do know that I'm proud of the woman I became during those terrifying months when I had to choose between my comfortable life and the truth. Sometimes I drive through Millbrook when I'm visiting Emma, and I pass by the house on Maple Ridge Drive where I lived for 5 years. It's been sold to a young family with small children, and there are bicycles in the driveway and a swing set in the backyard. It makes me happy to know that house is now filled with genuine love and honest relationships, instead of the lies and stolen money that once supported it. The most important thing I learned from this experience is that real security doesn't come from wealth or status or community approval. It comes from knowing that you can trust yourself to do the right thing, even when it costs you everything you thought you wanted, even when everyone around you thinks you're wrong, even when the person you love most in the world turns out to be someone you never really knew at all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.